Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for investing your time with us today online, which means that you are also investing in our state. We had a great in-person reception last night and with a very lively conversation between former state representative Bee Nguyen and co-host of Political Breakfast, Brian Robinson. And we decided to make this part of Insights virtual in order to make this content accessible across Georgia. Because from the dirt roads to the downtown connector, GBPI is working for all Georgians. My name is Staci Fox. I use she, her pronouns, and I am really honored to be the third president and CEO of the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. Believe it or not, GBPI turns 20 next year. I love to call GBPI our think and do tank because we know that research is only as powerful as what we do with it. A lot of people have a lot of names for GBPI, but you know what? The bottom line is that we are focused on the people, which does not make us partisan, but it does make us political. And we're not afraid of that. GBPI is committing to exploring all possibilities of solutions to ensure all Georgians can prosper. You know, this year's Insights conference comes at an important time as our state starts the year with spending and revenues at a historic imbalance. We have never had this level of resources on hand. In 2022, Georgia ended another fiscal year with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, the largest in our state's history. And this late legislative session, we can expect to see some fierce debates unfolding on how to best allocate this so-called surplus. But the truth is the term surplus is misleading because it wrongly implies that our state has met all of its fiscal responsibilities, when in fact, it has not. This $6 billion sitting in the bank actually results from a severe and irresponsible underfunding of vital needs across our state. It's like if I had a bunch of money in my checking account, but hadn't paid my mortgage, my car note, and all my other bills. It looks like I have all this extra money saved up when really I haven't. I haven't taken care of all the essentials. For decades, the legislature has allowed critical programs like K-12 public education, comprehensive healthcare, welfare services, and workforce development opportunities to go underfunded, flat funded, or flat out never funded at all. Our Governor Kemp, has the opportunity to create a more equitable state budget to help more Georgians realize the prosperity and growth that was previously inaccessible to them. Today, we're all here to talk about common sense solutions that support individuals and families in meeting their concrete needs as they seek economic stability and mobility. Solutions that will make our state more competitive and improve the quality of life and standard of living for generations to come. And we all believe at GBPI that we can get this done, but the work requires intention, humility, accountability, and transparency. With so much at stake, our North Star must be equity in order for us to actively and consistently walk this path forward. I do want to take a minute and thank our sponsors for Insights. A big shout out today to the Southern Poverty Law Center, United Way of Greater Atlanta, Georgians for a Healthy Future, Gale Consulting, Georgia Equality, Harry Hyman, the Frake Family Foundation, and Gears for making this event possible and allowing us to keep Insights free for all of y'all. I know you know, but we have a fantastic lineup of speakers and panelists ahead to discuss what it means to budget through an equity lens. The GBPI team will also share our key policy priorities for 2023. In addition to ensuring an equitable education system and prioritizing expansive quality healthcare for Georgians, we at GBPI also believe that our state should strengthen support for workers by providing training opportunities that will allow every working family to earn a livable wage. We also need to ensure that our policies, even at GBPI, reflect the diversity and richness of Georgia's immigrant community. Further, we have some work to do to address our government's over-reliance on fines and fees, which contributes to the criminalization of poverty throughout Georgia and leaves financially vulnerable, a lot of Georgians financially vulnerable and in a never-ending cycle of debt. GBPI's policy priorities are thought out. We spend a lot of time coming up with these as a team, and they are data informed, and they are about much needed reforms that will make Georgia a better place for everyone. With that said, I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker, one of our rock stars at GBPI, Danny Kanso. Danny is the Director of Legislative Strategy and our Senior Fiscal Analyst at the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. I know everybody wants to hear from Danny about the budget. He's going to provide us with some context around Georgia's unique fiscal position and what this historic moment means for investing in racial equity for Georgia. A few other quick reminders about the platform and this experience before we jump in. If you look at the original browser window with the full conference website, you'll see a menu on the left with several items. On the schedule side, if you're watching this, you probably figured out how to access a session. If you click schedule, the full schedule has every event. In each schedule item, you'll click join online session to see the panel. Under the people part of the platform, you can see a list of all attendees. We hope that you'll find each other and engage with each other, whether they're speakers or other attendees. When you click someone you want to chat with, head to people, search their name, and then click connect. Once connected, you can message them through the event page or send them an email. In the bulletin part of the platform, you'll find tweets using the hashtag Insights23, as well as other posts people can find. If you want to post a message to the bulletin, please do. Just click the section at the top of the page that says write a post. Each schedule item has a list of speakers, but you can also see the full list under the speakers menu item on the left side. Please check out our sponsors and the sponsors menu item. I know these are great partners to many of us across the state, and we're so grateful for them. You can find all the sponsors there, including the ones I just mentioned by name. All materials related to our panels can be found both in the schedule item and in the materials menu item. And finally, of course, there is a link in the platform to donate on the left-hand side. We don't do our work at GBPI without your help, without your investment in our work. And nobody does the work that GBPI does. People around the state, including the 262 people under that dome, rely on us to give them information to inform them using data to help make the best decisions they can for all Georgians. Also, please note, if you'd like to pose a question to our panelists at any point during the scheduled session, you can use questions icon to the right of your screen after you've joined the panel and drop your question in the chat section at the bottom. And last but not least, at 6 p.m. today, we will host a special organizers panel on how to change. Let me start that again. We're going to host a special organizers panel, y'all, tonight at 6 p.m. on how to build change outside of the State House. If you're registered to attend this session, be sure to set your reminder to log back on at 6 p.m. and join this important discussion later this evening. Again, thank you all so much for joining us online. We're doing this to reach everybody around the state, and thank you for investing in all Georgians along with us at GBPI. Danny, I'm turning this beautiful crowd over to you now.
Thank you so much, Staci, and thank you to all of those joining us this morning. It is great to be with you. And again, my name is Danny Kanso. I am GBPI Senior Fiscal Analyst and our Legislative Strategy Director. And thank you again to the many folks joining us this morning. And I am going to give an overview of Governor Kemp's executive budget proposal for the 2024 fiscal year, which of course begins on July 1st of 2023, and also covering some of those top highlights in the amended budget for 2023, which of course ends on June 30th. And I'd like to begin by looking at the governor's first and foremost constitutional duty of issuing the revenue estimate. We, of course, have been talking about that large surplus, that large imbalance between state spending and what we're collecting in state revenues. And so I think the best place to start is to look back over the last 4 years and also put 2024 in context. We have seen definitely one of the most volatile cycles in modern history, looking from 2019 to FY 2024 ahead, where of course in 2019, we were just coming out of a prolonged period of fiscal recovery after the Great Recession, when we saw state spending slashed really from 2009 forward. And so that meant underfunding our QBE formula for public schools until 2018. That meant severe cuts across our healthcare infrastructure, across state employees, freezes in salaries, things that we are still seeing the consequences of today. And so in 2019, we had just seen the state kind of reach those pre-recession levels, start to regain its footing. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. And we saw really dire forecasts before the federal government launched that unprecedented intervention to try to avoid the worst, to try to head off the pandemic-induced recession and preserve the economy. And largely, we saw great success from those measures. We saw a tremendous rebound in state revenues. We saw consumer spending increase. Folks have more money in their pockets. And again, those really unprecedented interventions worked and helped us avoid calamity and actually see the opposite, see revenue surged and start to see some really unprecedented revenue surpluses. And so that meant in 2021, we ended that fiscal year with just over $2 billion in unobligated surplus after filling up the state's revenue shortfall reserve to about $4.5 billion. That is the traditional way that the state has managed through recessions, going back to the mid-1970s. And then in 2022, we ended the fiscal year with about $6.6 billion in unobligated reserves above the state's full, again, revenue shortfall reserve that then increased to about $5.5 billion and follows state revenues at a maximum level under state law of 15%. Now what we see from the governor for the amended fiscal year and for 2024 is a really sharp projected decrease in state revenue collections. So we see the governor forecasting that personal income taxes, which are Georgia's largest source of revenue by far, are forecasted to fall by about 18%. Corporate income taxes forecasted to fall by about 25%, and overall state revenues down about 12%. Sales taxes, the governor has forecasted to grow by about 1%. And then what we see in 2024 is that those revenues are projected to be essentially flat, except for one source of tax revenue, which is a new one to the state and a product of those surpluses largely, and that is that the state is now collecting hundreds of millions of dollars in interest on the balance of the surpluses that we have, actually to the tune of more than $400 million in 2023 and 2024. So even as we have now both those large surpluses and revenue coming in off of the surpluses, we still see the revenue estimate kept essentially flat. And to be clear, the revenue estimate is a policy decision made unilaterally by the governor. Under Georgia's constitution, the governor has the constitutional authority to set the revenue estimate, and the General Assembly, those 236 members, have the constitutional authority over appropriating those funds. And so essentially the governor's revenue estimate can work as a cap to keep spending at a certain level. And effectively, when we raise revenue above that level, that goes into surplus. Traditionally, that would go into the revenue shortfall reserve until that account reaches 15%. And then it goes into essentially unobligated surplus and this other account where the state can freely appropriate those funds, but they have to be released by the governor under the revenue estimate. So just quickly to walk through, what that revenue estimate does look like for the upcoming fiscal year 2024. And what we see again is essentially flat from what has been revised for FY 2023, a total estimate of about $32.5 billion. So the income tax is far and away the largest source of state revenue, about 1 out of every $2 that the state spends. The personal income tax makes up most of that, Again, in 2022, the most recent fiscal year that ended about 6 months ago, the state collected over $18 billion. That is forecasted to fall to around $14.7 billion. The corporate income tax forecasted to take a 25% dip from over $2.5 billion down to $1.4 billion. And the sales tax forecasted to stay essentially flat at about $8.4 billion. And what we've seen is the sales tax increase pretty sizably during this pandemic period as consumer spending has gone up. That has been a little bit unusual for Georgia because we are one of the few states in the country that essentially taxes no services. However, we did have the marketplace facilitator online portion of the sales tax take place, as well as on rideshare services just ahead of the pandemic. And so that helped to get the full brunt of that on goods. But as we see in the economic forecast ahead, that as kind of things return to a bit more normalcy, services are expected to increase a little bit more than goods in terms of their growth rate. And so that may be part of why we see some stagnation there. And then again, in these other taxes and fees, the most interesting and biggest change is this interest on state deposits as well as on motor fuel, where traditionally on state deposits, we might collect about $45 to $50 million. And for both 2023 and 2024, we see that jumping in 2023 to about $480 million, and then a little bit more conservative an estimate for 2024 of just under $400 million. But a huge jump, and that is money that we're generating because of the level of cash on hand that we have, essentially, that should help to boost that revenue estimate. But again, we see it remaining fairly flat here. And then motor fuel taxes returning about $2 billion projected there. All of those funds are constitutionally obligated to go to infrastructure. And so just quickly to put into context what that means, even though this year we do see some positive additions, just because of kind of the trajectory in recent years, the level of austerity that state government has sustained, which has led to the workforce shrinking by about 30% over the last 15 years, and a few other things that we'll cover later in this presentation. What we see is that we actually are just now in line with where we were prior to the Great Recession. And that is just to show kind of how thinly we've grown through this pattern of cutting deeply during recessions and then growing back very slowly in the post period. And even though we're able to make some long-awaited adjustments, like the increasing the hope factor rate to cover full tuition and a few other things in here, we also are growing very slowly relative to the nation and relative to the historic trends of the state. And so in terms of our budget, the vast majority goes to cover healthcare and education. You can see pre-K through 12th grade, about 38%, higher education, about 15%, funded, of course, through the lottery in large part. Healthcare, about 21% of state government, followed by transportation, that is primarily funded through the gas tax, about $2 billion a year. And then you can see corrections, about 6%, an area that our state has really neglected, one of the areas of state government that is seeing tremendous crisis, huge turnover levels, real difficulty in meeting its kind of basic mission. And then general government, a group of over 20 state agencies, about 4% of state government. And then you can see debt service, a very low share, actually, about 4% that we've seen kind of falling as well in recent years as a percentage of state revenues, the state taking on less debt, and that means fewer investments. Human services, about 3%, an area, where we've seen very little investment, and then public safety and the courts rounding out the budget. So you can see the state really, almost everything that the state does is fairly essential, very little fat in the state budget, and actually tremendous need on the other side. So just very quickly to talk about the upcoming economic forecast, some of the best data that we have is from the University of Georgia Terry School of Business, the Selig Center for Economic Growth, that annually reports on the state's forecast. And so actually, even though the probability of a recession nationwide is fairly high, the forecast that we see for Georgia is rather optimistic. So the governor has put forward a very conservative revenue estimate that actually predicts that from the personal and corporate income tax side, the state may take a pretty big hit from where we were, and we've heard from the state economists and other folks that a large share of that is anticipating from reduced capital gains because of the poor performance relatively of the stock market year over year in comparison. But what we actually see when we dig into the forecast is, actually deeper, decline beyond that, certainly, with about 18% of a decrease expected in personal income tax revenues and about 25% in corporate tax revenues. And again, that can be a tool to help manage conservatively. But what we see in the economic forecast data is that overall inflation-adjusted consumer expenditures are projected to increase about 1%, and that actually means growth of around 3%. Personal income to actually rise slightly, of about 1%, even accounting for anticipated inflation around 3%. Spending for services to continue to increase, albeit faster than for goods. And what they forecast is non-farm employment to decrease by just about 2%, about half of that of what's expected nationally, and for Georgia's unemployment rate to rise to about 4.4%. And alongside that, for overall GDP to fall to actually increase by about 2%, in contrast to what they anticipate to be, again, a fairly mild recession with a 0.2% decline nationally. And so given those numbers, we would expect revenues to hold up fairly strongly. And again, what we see is a really conservative sort of shoestring budget in a lot of areas. So now, one other tool at the state's disposal that is really not being used very much in this budget is being used a little bit in the amended budget to fund 2 tax rebates, but is not being used at all in the 2024 budget, are Georgia's reserves. So you can see here sort of the state's revenue shortfall reserve since the Great Recession. And the revenue shortfall reserve was created in 1976 to help the state manage through periods of economic recession without having to make sharp cuts in spending or drastic changes in tax policy, with short notice, without consideration. And so basically that was created and expanded eventually to reach a maximum level of 15% of state revenues. So the state in previous recessions relied on that account. We saw that in the early 2000s. We saw that with the Great Recession to tremendous effect, where it was drawn down to just about $100 million. And then you can see that it was built back up primarily over the Governor Deal administration, with the state generating an average of about $400 million a year, more than it was spending. That would go to surplus each year. And then really kind of taking off in the extreme in the last 2 years in the pandemic era. And so what we have now is a revenue shortfall reserve that has been filled to its maximum level for the past 2 years at 15%. And then above that, an unobligated reserve account that has also continued to grow. So those unobligated reserves reached about $2.2 billion at the end of 2021. The state spent about $1 billion of that on tax rebates. And then in 2022, at the end of the last fiscal year that ended June 30th of last year, that account swelled all the way up to $6.6 billion. And on top of that, we have about $1.9 billion in lottery reserves. Again, those funds have to be used for higher education or pre-K, and then about $50 million in the state's debt reserve. So this is an unprecedented level of cash on hand. We have never had this level of resources in Georgia's history. And again, largely what we're choosing to do is on a very limited basis, use those funds for tax rebates. And also, in the last year to cover half the year suspension of the gas tax. So that's about $3 billion that's been proposed, but leaves about $3.5 billion in unobligated surplus and the state's rainy day fund account full. So another area that I'd just like to briefly cover, where again we've seen kind of the state act very conservatively is in its use of debt. Under the Georgia Constitution, each year the state can issue a debt service that would be equivalent to a payment of 10% of its prior year revenues. And so what we saw in the Great Recession is even as the state was forced to keep spending down, one way that it helped to kind of make up for that was with borrowing and some of those long-term capital investments. So we saw, for example, in 2011, that reached up to 8%, almost double what we're seeing as a percentage of state revenue today. And then we've sort of steadily seen that level fall, hover around half of the state's capacity over the last 4 years, and see it at less than half the capacity for the upcoming year. And that is just, not fully using what we have available when we have some deep needs. We'll talk a little bit about K through 12 transportation, but that's an area that is emblematic of other areas in education in the state budget where we've seen the state try to shift greater responsibility onto local governments, where out of $1.1 billion in estimated student transportation costs, now local governments are picking up about 80% of that, 75% with the state picking up about half of the share that it had historically going back to the 1990s. So that's just one area of concern where we can get a bigger bang for our buck. That is the value that we get from a AAA bond rating in many ways, and we're choosing not to use much of that authority. So this is an area where we see real concern in the state budget. When we look at the state health benefit plan, and particularly costs that are being passed on to local school districts and educators, with a massive increase forecasted in the upcoming year, and that's already started from some personnel as of January of this year. So essentially, the per member per month contribution rate for the employer that is kind of mandated to be paid by either the school district or the state is going up from $945 to $1,580. That's a 67% increase, the first such change that we've seen in about 9 years, since 2014. So even though the state budget right now for 2024 has about $846 million in allocated to cover some of those costs, much of those costs are actually being shifted down to local school districts. So we see that for some certified personnel, as well as share of what are called classified employees, folks like school bus drivers, cafeteria workers, some of those who are already the lowest paid in the school in many instances, who are getting ready to see these massive increase in healthcare costs, with the state not offering help to cover them. So in the state budget, we see recognized about $228 million of expected costs that are anticipated to be shifted down to local districts and paid for some of these classified employees, about $267 million for certified personnel who are just paid with other dollars, and then about $228 million, about $249 million for the other share of these classified employees. So all told, we're talking about 98,000 employees whose premiums are set to rise, that the state is asking local districts to come up with funding to pay for, to the tune of about $745 million. And that's a huge deal. That is not money that folks were anticipating, budgeting for in many cases. And that's a huge blow to these districts if the state doesn't step up and find that money to help avoid passing that on. And what's particularly concerning is that we also see the state attempting to do a short-term one-time tax rebate for property taxes. And we know that schools generate most of their funding from their property tax base. And so on one hand, the state could be pushing this unfunded liability down, asking them to come up with $750 million, maybe more, and at the same time putting pressure on them on their property taxes and kind of just creating confusion. And so that's going to be a big area where the General Assembly needs to step in, where we have a strong precedent of the state covering those costs, and where the state has a responsibility to act in this case, particularly because we know the state has such an extraordinary level of resources on hand. Another major area in the budget that we will hear a lot more about is in Medicaid, the partial Medicaid expansion plan, where we're now starting to see significant resources allocated under the budget to start that as early as July 1st, in the upcoming 2024 fiscal year. And so the enrollment projections have continued to shift as the state is getting ready to take on what is really an extraordinary process of Medicaid redetermination, where all of those who are enrolled in Medicaid have to have their eligibility redetermined, potentially, unless the state chooses to pursue a different course of action with something like Medicaid expansion. And so under that, the state is projecting, because so many people have gained coverage under the pandemic era, that could increase the potential enrollment. So we've laid out just 3 scenarios here under the partial Medicaid expansion to compare to full Medicaid expansion. And the most important thing to note is that the cost per enrollee doesn't change, because the enhanced match under the Affordable Care Act for full Medicaid expansion is only available if the state chooses full expansion. We have to go all the way to 138% of the poverty level, and allow access to that pool of 500,000 Georgians that for the most part otherwise don't have a way to access healthcare. And so otherwise, instead of a 9-to-1 match, the state would get essentially a 2-to-1, 66% match. So the cost per enrollee would be about $2,500. And so right now in the state budget, we see about $118 million allocated. So that would be sufficient under this cost per enrollee to cover about 47,000 people. If the state, as we've heard from some folks, could reach an enrollment of about 100,000 people, then we'd be talking about a first-year cost of around $249 million. Again, the same cost per enrollee. If we were to take the full eligible population that we see projected at 345,000 people and applied that cost per enrollee, the cost would be astronomical, about $859 million, and that's compared to less than $240 million for full Medicaid expansion. And now actually under the American Rescue Plan, which has changed statute indefinitely, the state would also qualify for a bump in its Medicaid match for 2 years if it expanded Medicaid, which we estimate would be worth at least $700 million. So enough intended to cover at least the first 2 years of expansion. So certainly if we just look at the numbers, it is plainly obvious that fully expanding Medicaid would be the most fiscally responsible direction and the best way to cover the most people at the lowest cost. So now just to turn over to what we see kind of across the board in this budget, the governor has proposed adding $2,000 in pay increases across the university system, K through 12, and for state employees. And that might sound good, but we really have a state government that is in crisis across many of our agencies that are struggling to meet their basic missions. So in 2022, the last fiscal year, we saw state government turnover reach an all-time high. That actually for full-time employees was over 29%, which is just astronomical to imagine. And at the same time, if we look back from 2008 to 2022, we've seen the overall full-time workforce decrease by about 30%, from around 83,000 to less than 60,000 people. At the same time, the state's population has grown by more than 1 million. And so you can imagine, we've heard agency heads and other folks brag about folks doing more for less, but that becomes really unsustainable. And that's why we have this massive turnover rate, which has led to a host of consequences that 11 million Georgians feel every day. in having less access to the state services that they depend on. And so at the same time that we've seen that massive turnover, we've also seen the number of applicants for state positions fall to an all-time low. And so after last year's salary increase of $5,000, the median executive branch starting salaries now is about $34,000. The overall salary about $44,000. And so if we add $2,000 onto that, we can expect to see a little bit of a marginal change there. And at the same time, agencies last year actually returned about $256 million, largely because of that turnover, because there were positions that went unfilled, after folks left or were unable to be found. And that is a serious problem that has to be addressed systematically and, individually across the board. Increases are needed, certainly, but we have a lot more work to do. And part of that starts with evaluating personnel numbers, hiring, doing meaningful things to adjust those budgets beyond simply requesting that they keep them flat from year to year. So finally, I want to conclude with just a high level evaluation of some of the positive things and some of the big things that we see in the budget beyond what we've already talked about. And we will have our broader analyst team hone in on many of these areas a bit later. So in the amended budget, we really see three kind of one-time big contributions. We see the $1.1 billion allocation for a new $20,000 one-time homestead exemption. So that would be how the state is going to distribute this sort of tax payment to counties and school districts. But again, the big problem here is that the school districts are getting ready to see a increase in employee employer state health benefit plan payments of about $750 million. So that almost entirely wipes that out. And this is a one-time payment. So in order for that to get through, it's going to be really, really important for the state to address that, long-term issue and find that funding to avoid passing on that massive increase to school districts across our state. And at the same time, putting this kind of artificial pressure on them when asking them to come up with more money, and knowing that their primary source of revenue is property taxes. So that is one of the most convoluted areas that we see, in an area that needs to be addressed. We then see $1 billion for tax refunds of $250 for those who are single filers, $500 for those who are married filing jointly. The same program was implemented last year. The big issue here is that we think that needs to be at a minimum fully refundable, so that everyone can get those payments, not just including the very lowest income folks who also paid into that surplus through sales taxes, through fines and fees, through a host of other ways. And if we're giving back a portion, certainly deserve to receive some of that. And then about $156 million in various K through 12 grants that I'm sure will be talked about a little bit more in depth in terms of some of their benefits, some of their flaws later in the program. And then, as I covered, that $2,000 cost of living increase across state positions. We also see about $27 million to fund kind of one of those long-term issues that we see built into the state budget, where in 2013, the General Assembly acted to say that we should have a minimum school counselor ratio of 1 to 450, and the state was just refused to fund that until this budget. So we see $27 million there to try to close that gap. And then a long-awaited GBPI priority, a priority for many across the state that we've seen legislation on, almost perennially since 2012, when the change to HOPE was made. And that is $61 million to close that gap and change the funding factor to get up to 100% of tuition, up from 90% when those 2012 era changes were initiated. And so the initial forecast that we've seen is, on average, that could be around $500 per student, which will make a big difference, and is a very positive step forward on that front. In terms of mental behavioral health and funding for those with disabilities, we see a little bit of progress in this budget, but given, again, the fiscal position, this is an area where more needs to be done, and there's really room for the General Assembly to act here. But what we do see is about $14.5 million to increase waiver slots for the now comp waiver. Again, a long-awaited priority where we need to address really lengthy waiting lists, and a severe backlog, and then about $19 million of investments in our behavioral health infrastructure from the state standpoint. And again, that's a positive step, but one that we need to see on a larger scale to be able to meet that tremendous amount of demand across Georgia. And we also, just an issue that I haven't touched on as much, but that I know Leah, our health policy expert, will discuss, which is that Georgia is getting ready to take on one of the most ambitious challenges that we've had in recent years. At the same time, again, that we have a state government that is really struggling to meet its basic mission already. And that is finding, redetermining the eligibility of everyone across our Medicaid program. And that could mean a loss of coverage for hundreds of thousands of people across Georgia, while also creating, a real bureaucratic nightmare for the state. And Medicaid expansion is one way to help avoid a process that could be really lengthy and burdensome. But right now we have about $4 million in the budget for additional Medicaid eligibility caseworkers in the 2024 budget, a bit more in the amended budget, to help process that redetermination. But again, that is going to be a really big challenge for the state, and one that is by no means fully addressed here. About $52.2 million in new money for that limited Medicaid pathways waiver. That is in addition to what we see as $65 million recognized from the 2021 budget to begin work, again, pending some of those federal approvals and standing up that program. So we're going to be watching very closely, and also advocating for why in this moment with Medicaid redetermination ahead, it is so critical to reconsider full Medicaid expansion. And then what we also see is about $312 million to account for the federal funding that we've seen during the pandemic era starting to taper off in Medicaid and Peach Care. And then just a bit of a missed opportunity where in the 2024 budget, even though we're keeping that state debt service level below half of our capacity, less than 5%, only about $23 million here to purchase school buses statewide. And this is an area where we have hundreds of thousands of students on the road every day, and an aging school bus infrastructure. Again, more and more of that burden shifted onto local governments, and becoming a real dire area of need as the state has continued to scale back its level of investment year to year over the past 30 years. And so that's an area where we hope the General Assembly, again, will will help to close some of those gaps as local school districts are already facing huge renewed burdens. So with that, I will end this part of the program, and I really do appreciate all of y'all joining us. And up next, we will have our community as catalyst, a grass view of what's possible.